Okay, this is number 5, eukaryotic microbes. Slide 22, looking at the algae. So, not a whole lot of algae affect us, at least humans, but we will look at what makes an algae, where they live, and there are a few examples that we should know about. So what makes an algae an algae? This is a difficult question to answer because, again, the algae are very diverse and they really don't belong as a single group. We can think of algae as being different from plants because in general the algae lack what we might call an organized vascular system. Most plants have things like xylem and phloem, and those vessels pump the nutrients and water around the plant. Algae don't have that. There are many single-celled algae. There are no, if we are using that 6-kingdom system, there are no single-celled plants. But all of our algae are photosynthetic, which means that they are typically green in coloration because they have the green chemical called chlorophyll, and because they are eukaryotic, they keep that chlorophyll inside chloroplasts. So, if we look at the algae ancestor, we have various branches. And this is why the kingdom protist is meaningless, because we've put a circle around these things and we call them algae, but we then put a circle around these things and call them plants. There's the separation, the difference between the algae and the plants is really non-existent in terms of evolutionary relatedness. So all of our things here, all related, all come from a common ancestor, but we have this artificial separation between stuff that we lump as algae on this side and stuff that we lump as plants on that side. If we look at an organism here in my pictures down here, this is an organism that has a direct ancestor with plants. The difference between this and a plant, say a plant we call moss. Moss does sit inside the plants and not the algae. The physical difference between this and a moss is non-existent. There are also many other single-celled organisms that we call algae. Down here, I'll come to this later on in the protozoans. This is a system that tries to classify organisms in a truly related sense, looking at their DNA, looking at their genetic relatedness. You can see here all the things in green are stuff that we can pluck out, or indeed that was plucked out and lumped together in this group called algae. All the blue stuff here is stuff that is pulled out and lumped together in the group of protozoans. So putting all this stuff into one group where it doesn't belong makes no sense. If we were then to describe algae, we would say that they are simple, typically simple eukaryotes. They are photosynthetic. Most algae are aquatic, whereas plants are terrestrial. There are microscopic single-celled algae. There are macroscopic, a large algae. There are unicellular and multicellular algae. All of our algae contain chloroplasts, and they contain the chemical chlorophyll. In particular, they contain the chemical chlorophyll A. Many of our algae contain other pigments, as do plant cells. All algae, as we currently describe them, are photosynthetic. Many algae have cell walls, and just like plants, many algae have cell walls made out of cellulose. One thing to note, agar. We use agar in the lab. Agar was that material that Robert Koch's companions, or Robert Koch's colleague's wife, was using to thicken her jams and jellies. And Robert Koch was using gelatin to grow his microbes on, but the gelatin kept liquefying at warm temperatures. So agar is what we now use to grow. We mix in nutrients into the agar, and it's a very important medium for growing of microbes. It's also very important, there are other important things that come from red algae. Agar comes from red algae in particular. Lots of food additives come from red algae. Let's look at the microscopic algae on slide 24. Single-celled, often propelled by a flagella, or free-floating. Again, there's a huge variety, because we've plucked the algae out of all these different kinds of organisms. There's really no unifying feature, apart from they're all eukaryotic and they're all photosynthetic, but that covers a very wide range of stuff. So important algae, diatoms are very important. Green algae, these are the ancestors of modern plants. We'll look at dinoflagellates in a second. Euglenids, these are kind of interesting. Not only are they photosynthetic and they have chloroplasts, they can also go through the process of phagocytosis. So they are very flexible in their structure. They typically have a flagella, but they can change shape, and they're jam-packed full of chloroplasts for photosynthesis. But when there's no light, they can also ingest material from the environment. So an organism like a euglenoid is both autotrophic and heterotrophic, or it can be one. It can be both. It can be one and then the other. Some algae exist as colonies, and so here's my euglena changing shape. Here's my euglena with its chloroplasts absorbing sunlight and being autotrophic. Here's my euglena still with its chloroplasts, but say now it's nighttime or there's no sun available. Instead, the euglena can switch to being heterotrophic. Colonies are good for a few different reasons. Think about an organism trying to eat you. If you are a single algal cell, you can get eaten pretty easily. But if you consist of a colony of hundreds, if not thousands of cells, you then are not lunch for these organisms who are trying to eat you up. On to slide 25, the macroscopic algae, macroscopic meaning big. You see algae growing in ponds and rivers. You see seaweed growing in the sea. This is kelp, for example. It does have structures. It has like a leaf-like blade. Let me put that back down. So here's our kelp. It has a leaf-like blade. It has a stalk-like stipe. Has a root-like holdfast. But these structures aren't equivalent to the leaves, stems and roots in plants. The holdfast is just to keep it in place. There are no differentiated structures in the stipe or the blade, and there are there's no vascular tissue. So fresh and salt water and moist soil, that's where you find algae. What do algae do for us? They are major producers of oxygen, and they consume carbon dioxide because of the reactions of photosynthesis. H2O plus CO2 goes to glucose plus oxygen. In fact, it's the algae in conjunction with the photosynthetic bacteria and photosynthetic prokaryotes that enriched the atmosphere to such a degree that big, energetic humans could start to live. They're very important in the oceans. Different photosynthetic pigments will absorb different colors of light, and as light enters water, the different colors are available at different depths. So algae are adapted to living at different depths. Plankton. Algae make up a very important component of plankton, known as phytoplankton. They are the basis of many food chains. So we can probably imagine a terrestrial food chain where a mouse eats some grass, and then a snake eats the mouse, and then a hawk eats the snake. So you can follow your food chain back to what's called a primary producer. That is the organism that got its energy from the sun. It's the primary producer is the organism that puts the energy into the environment. In an aquatic environment, algae and things like diatoms, which are part of the phytoplankton, are very important in putting carbon and energy into the environment. They are grabbing carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. They are grabbing energy through photosynthesis. So diatoms and other phytoplankton are the basis of marine food chains. So the zooplankton eats the phytoplankton. So zooplankton are just very small animals. They eat the phytoplankton and the energy is passed to them. And then a fish eats the zooplankton, and then a squid eats the fish, and then a seal eats the squid, and then a killer whale eats the seal. 40% of marine primary productivity is thanks to diatoms. So a little short of half of all the energy and all the carbon that's in the ocean is there because of the action of diatoms. Algal reproduction, very varied. They can be asexual, they can just break off and the pieces can grow, or they can go through sexual reproduction. They have quite a complex generation of a haploid organism, a diploid organism. They do make gametes, they do make spores, so I won't spend too much time talking about that. On to slide 27, an algae that is important to humans. Algal blooms, also known as red tides, are very important in many parts of human society. What happens is that during the warmer months, during the summer, if there is an enrichment of the environment, say through upwelling or nutrient runoff, maybe from untreated sewage or from fertilizers being sprayed on a field, and then the rain washes the fertilizer into the water, that sets up all the conditions by which a certain kind of algae called a dinoflagellate can go crazy. They go crazy and they have these huge population explosions. So you can imagine, now these dinoflagellates are single-celled organisms, so you can have to just imagine how many single-celled dinoflagellates it would take to turn the ocean red like this. One particular, there are many algae involved in red tides and involved in algal blooms. The one that causes red tides in particular is this stuff called gonialax. It has this red coloration, and when it's in high concentrations, that's what causes this red to be physically seen in the oceans. Now the problem with red tides is twofold. First of all of these cells in the water, they are all respiring and they are all taking up oxygen. They are aerobic. So one thing that kills, and this can decimate aquatic coastal ecosystems. And if that coastal ecosystem is important, say for fish or other wildlife, they can be killed by these red tides. First reason is that there's so many of them, they use up all the oxygen, and then there's no oxygen left for the other organisms. The other important thing is that they make toxins. They make toxins, and when they exist in these incredible high numbers, the amount of toxin is also very high, and it can kill. It can kill fish and other aquatic animals. Neurotoxins, saxitotoxin and gonitoxin. Saxitotoxin, also known as paralytic shellfish toxin, amongst the most potent non-protein poisons. Now the reason why it harms humans is that, first of all, the human who is relying on that ecosystem for their livelihood are going to be affected. But typically it affects humans when humans eat shellfish that have been feeding on the gonialax. The shellfish themselves don't get harmed by the toxin, but as they consume the toxin, they consume this dinoflagellate, the level of toxin builds up and builds up and builds up in the shellfish, and then when the human eats the shellfish, the human gets one big dose of the toxin and it can be fatal. Cooking does not destroy this toxin. It's a non-protein toxin, therefore its structure won't be destroyed by heat. So you may have heard of the idea of you should only eat shellfish in months with the letter R, and that is to avoid the summer months when there could be red tides. So algae, what makes an algae an algae? Photosynthetic, eukaryotic, not technically plants. Don't have vascular tissue, no phloem and xylem at least. Different types of algae. There are microscopic algae, there are diatoms, there are dinoflagellates, there are the large macroscopic algae, there are the colonial algae. Benefits of being in a colony: make you big, you can't get eaten. And then, how do red tides cause human diseases, and what organism is to blame in particular? It's this one, Gonialix. Okay, that is that for algae.